from the ZD-5 sold to the USSR. Production started in 1934, but by the time World War II began, the vehicle had improved to a 14-ton pull capacity. About 4,000 of the vehicles were made. 24 were converted before the war to become self-propelled mounts for the 8.8cm flak. Placed in Panzerjäger units, they were primarily to be used as assault guns to destroy bunkers, but they also had a role in destroying any heavy armour which might have gotten in their way. In addition to hauling large artillery, this half-track was also used as a tank recovery vehicle. They also came with a 5-ton winch as standard. Finally, Big Daddy was the FAMO SDKFZ-9, the 18-tonner. This very capable half-track was developed to haul the heaviest artillery, such as the 24cm gun, the 35.5cm howitzer, and the 12.8cm flak. It was also used as a tank recovery vehicle, although at an 18-ton haul provided by the 12.8-litre 250 horsepower V12, it still required 3 of them combined to haul the Tiger I. 6-ton and 10-ton crane variants were also made to aid the mechanics. The catch was that the vehicle was about as difficult to make as a Panther, but they still made about 2,500 of them. There was an attempt to simplify the system overall with the creation of the Schwerer Wehrmachtsschlepper, an 8-ton half-track designed by Büssing-Nag. It wasn't particularly successful. The heavy, dry-pin tracks and 100 horsepower engine resulted in it having great traction, but low speed. Too slow to do the intended job of hauling artillery, the 850 or so made mainly ended up in the supply trains. The one major type of German half-track not yet mentioned is the Multier, or the Mule. These were conversions of standard trucks, a little bit like the American half-track in that context, which had their rear axles replaced by the suspension systems of mainly older Cardan Loyd designs. They were developed primarily for the poor conditions found on the Eastern Front. Somewhere over 22,000 vehicles were produced, of which about 5,000 were based on the Opel Blitz and 14,000 on the Ford V3000S. Multiers were designated SDKFZ 3 and 4. Lastly, there's the SDKFZ 2, the Kettengrad, which is more of a half-track motorcycle. Originally designed for the Luftwaffe as a tractor for paratroopers and as an aircraft tug, the Army started using them to haul small trailers and as an off-road runabout. They maintained the complex lubricated links and the track steering systems of their larger cousins, but after the war they became popular as agricultural vehicles and arguably as the first recreational ATV. There is one more country to visit. After seeing the success of the German mechanized units in 1940, the Japanese decided that this whole tank division business had some merit. And it was obvious that the troops needed to have transport similar to that provided to the Panzer Grenadiers. Hino Motors took on the challenge in 1941, and by 1944, the Type 1 Ho-Ha had entered production. Pretty obviously influenced by the 251, the vehicle was also of a 3/4 track design, but the suspension was domestically designed instead of using the German interleaved system. As with the rest of the Japanese plans for armoured divisions, production wasn't even close to meeting establishment requirements, and it had a curious failing in that none of the 3 machine guns would fire to the front. Despite over 100,000 half-tracks being used through World War II, the design suddenly fell out of favour. The only notable post-war producer was Czechoslovakia. Skoda and Tatra had been involved in the SDKFZ 251 production, so to equip the Czech army, they dusted off the plans, put in a better engine, added overhead cover, and replaced the maintenance-intensive wet lubricated needle-bearing track with a much simpler dry pin system. Tatra also built the Schwerer Wehrmachtsschlepper after the war as the T809. Though World War II American half-tracks would continue to see a long service life abroad, particularly with Israel, with less of a stress on time, production moved to full-tracked vehicles. That move had already started by the end of World War II. There is one vestige of the half-track still in common enough military use, and that is the attachable band, which can be fitted to dual rear axle vehicles. Sort of similar to the original track found on the Model T snowmobile, by World War II, a track was developed to be fitted around the rear wheels of the CCKW Deuce and a Half truck. They didn't replace the wheels, they were quite simply a track which went around them, and as such they lacked the sprocket drive and risked some slippage. Some Soviet truck designs could have these fitted as well. However, though these days over-the-tire tracks are mainly found in civilian applications, if necessary, they can still be fitted to the military trucks of today. And that brings us to pretty much the end of the story of the half-tracks. Hope you found it interesting and informative, and we return you now to your regularly scheduled host.
While the French and German armies are locked in a bloody struggle at Verdun, the Russian army is on the march in the east to help its Western allies. General Alexei Brusilov's new tactics and training have revitalized his armies, who are ready to strike the unsuspecting Austro-Hungarians. In just a few weeks, thousands of square kilometers of territory will change hands. Hundreds of thousands of men will be killed or wounded, and the Austro-Hungarian army will be shaken to its core. It's the Brusilov offensive. By 1916, the Eastern Front was facing a stalemate not entirely unlike that in the West. The deadlock was not as rigid and the East was still more mobile, but the fighting had developed into the familiar combination of extensive trench networks, heavy use of artillery, and strategic impasse. But that had not been the case the first 2 years of the war. The front line had dramatically swung back and forth. In 1914, the Russians defeated the Austro-Hungarians in Galicia, but the Germans had pushed back the Russians in East Prussia. In 1915, the combined armies of the Central Powers had driven the Russians back on what became known as the Great Retreat. Both sides then consolidated their gains and built elaborate trench systems. In March 1916, the Russians launched an offensive around Lake Narach in response to a French request to relieve pressure in the west. Although the Russians far outnumbered the defending Germans, the offensive was a disaster. 78,000 Russians were killed or wounded in just 10 days, and Russian morale took a serious hit. The Central Powers' confidence in the East, on the other hand, soared. Some German and Austrian commanders believed that the Russians were spent, but Chief of the German General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn knew a decisive push into Russia in 1916 was impossible. The Central Powers were still outnumbered almost 2-1, and there was no strategic goal in range that would guarantee Russian collapse. So the Russians started 1916 with a defeat at Lake Narach, but then the Central Powers began to fall out amongst themselves. Austria-Hungary and Germany were allies, but they were by no means equals. Both sides understood that without German support, Austria would have likely collapsed earlier in the war. But that didn't mean they agreed on strategy. Success in the East and on the Italian front in 1915 had boosted Austrian spirits, and debates raged about where they should focus their main effort in 1916. Falkenhayn wanted to push more resources against the French at Verdun. He believed that a decisive battle was only possible in the West. This meant that the Germans would have to move some of their troops to the west from the east, and the Austro-Hungarians would have to pick up the slack against the Russians. Austrian Chief of Staff Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, of course, felt differently. Conrad wanted to use Austro-Hungarian troops against Italy in South Tyrol and wanted German troops to shoulder the burden in the east. Both the Central Powers flatly refused to help the other and developed largely separate efforts. One bright spot was the addition of the Ottoman 15th Corps to the Eastern Front to help bolster the Central Powers' defenses. The growing animosity between Germany and Austria-Hungary was reflected elsewhere in the East as well. German staff officers like General Linsingen questioned the ability and spirit of Austro-Hungarian colleagues appointed through their dynastic links, such as the general of the Fourth Army, Archduke Joseph Ferdinand. Meanwhile, German General Hans von Seeckt regularly complained of Habsburg Schlamperei, or sloppiness. Despite German criticism, by 1916 the Austro-Hungarians' opinion of themselves had recovered. The incredible ease with which the Russians were repelled at Lake Narach, where the Russians had fought the Germans, not the Austro-Hungarians, had persuaded many Austrian officers like Colonel Rudolf Kundman of their own superiority. They attack stupidly in thick masses. They can do no more because they have no training. The Austrian Second Army diarist shared this less than charitable opinion of Russian abilities. The Russian reserves are weak mama's boys who immediately begin to cry when attacked sharply. Austro-Hungarian morale had improved, but the opposite was true for the Russian army. The Lake Narach debacle had also convinced many Russian officers and men that their German enemies were superior, but the country was already committed to a summer offensive. In December 1915, Britain, France, Italy, Serbia, and Russia met at Chantilly to develop a new formal policy of cooperation for 1916. The Allies all agreed that if one of them came under attack, the others would launch offensives to distract and drain the resources of the Central Powers. Generals like Russian Western Front Commander Alexei Ewert and Northern Front Commander Alexei Kuropatkin were uneasy with these arrangements. Their Lake Narach failure had been the result of a French request for assistance, and they were equally pessimistic about future offensives. Instead, they advocated going on the defensive while building up more heavy artillery. Some historians have suggested they often requested unrealistic amounts of resources to avoid attacking and potentially damaging their already fragile reputations. However, Chief of Staff Mikhail Alexeyev demanded offensives in accordance with the Chantilly Accords. That's when Southwestern Front Commander Alexei Brusilov stepped up. Unlike his colleagues, Brusilov was confident Russian troops could achieve success if they were properly led, prepared, and trained. The intellectually inclined Brusilov also stood out for his willingness to promote officers regardless of social standing. Although Brusilov accepted that Russia still lacked heavy weapons, he nonetheless pressured other commanders into agreeing to an offensive. So he and Alexeyev created a new plan for summer 1916. Ewert would attack the Germans opposite his Western Front, which enjoyed a 750,000 troop advantage over the defenders. The primary Russian objective was German-occupied Vilnius. But 10 days before Ewert's offensive, Brusilov's southwestern front would strike the Austro-Hungarian lines to the south. Although the Russians only outnumbered the Austro-Hungarians by about 130,000 men, they hoped to draw German reinforcements away from Ewert. Brusilov's main effort would be made by the 8th Army towards Lutsk, but the attack would be along a 450-kilometer front to mask its true intentions and to create the potential for additional breakthroughs. Furthermore, if his 9th Army could make gains in the south, it might give the reluctant Romanians enough confidence to enter the war against the Central Powers. Alexeyev approved the plan, but made it clear to Brusilov he wouldn't get many additional troops or resources. According to Brusilov's memoirs, another front commander, probably Kuropatkin, approached him after the meeting with some advice. I was approached by one of the senior generals who sat next to me and expressed his surprise that I sought permission to attack and said, "You have just been appointed commander, and though you would be unhappy not to attack, don't risk your reputation, which is currently very high. Are you courting disaster, seeking dismissal and the loss of your military status that you have earned to date? In your place, I would be distancing myself from any offensive operations, as, given the current state of affairs, you will just do yourself harm." Brusilov had volunteered for an offensive, but he did not intend to fight in the same way as his less optimistic colleagues. He felt he'd learned valuable lessons from Russian mistakes, but also from the methods of the Entente and the enemy. Traditionally, Russian commanders tried to keep their offensive tactics as simple as possible. A lack of training among the infantry meant mass columns, sometimes up to 20 men deep, would advance on narrow fronts. Russian artillery use was sometimes unsystematic. This meant the defenders could concentrate their fire on the small number of breaches created in their wire, resulting in massive casualties for the attackers. Brusilov, however, reformed these assault tactics as well as the overall strategy of an attacking front. Instead of concentrating on a single narrow front, he ordered his commanders to personally identify sectors up to 25 kilometers wide for assault. By attacking numerous locations, the enemy would be unable to concentrate their reserves or recognize the true objective of the attack. When Russian troops achieved local breakthroughs, Brusilov could pour in reserves to expand the breach and roll up the flanks. Brusilov understood that his approach carried the risk of spreading out his strength. This means of action had, obviously, its downside, in that I could not concentrate at the main point of attack the men and artillery that I could have if I had established just one strike force. Since Brusilov himself wouldn't know in advance where the breakthrough would come, a larger strategic goal was tougher to develop. Instead, his goal was to destroy as much of the enemy forces as possible. To achieve this, Russian troops would use new tactics by advancing in 4 waves. The first, armed with hand grenades, would clear the first defensive line. The second, similarly armed wave would follow close behind and immediately attack the second enemy line. Once the second line was breached, troops in the third Russian wave would bring up the machine guns to prepare the area for a cavalry breakout in the fourth wave. Artillery would also play a role in preparing the battlefield. Applying tactics he observed from the French, Brusilov gave the artillery more sophisticated fire missions backed up by aerial reconnaissance. Once the guns had blasted holes in the Austrian wire, they would then smash communication trenches to cut off the front line. After each fire mission, observers would conduct assessments and adjust accordingly. Russian guns would no longer direct unaimed fire behind enemy trenches. Brusilov also noted that the Russian infantry started their attacks from too far away, sometimes up to 2 kilometers from the enemy's first trenches. Instead, this time the infantry would now dig hidden sap trenches into no man's land to within 60 meters of Austro-Hungarian positions. To keep these measures secret, the Russians adopted improved operational security and deception, including fake radio messages. Assault troops close to the front would wait unseen in large underground shelters before going over the top. The Russians even used the spoil produced by digging the shelters to conceal new positions and supplies. The new approach required rigorous training and higher expectations of the officers. Staff officers created replicas of Austro-Hungarian positions behind the lines for mock assaults by both infantry and artillery working together. For artillery officer Alexander Vinogradsky, all of this was revolutionary. The infantry practiced and adapted methods of attacking fortified positions specifically prepared for this purpose. We too had the opportunity to study the most effective means of providing support in the realities of time and terrain, instead of having to rely on probabilities. This mode of work, where nothing was left to chance or improvisation, was something new for us. Not all Russian commanders believed in the new tactics, including 8th Army commander Alexei Kalydin, but by and large, Russian morale and confidence was much improved. So, by summer 1916, Brusilov's southwestern front had undergone a transformation. Meanwhile, it remained business as usual in the Austro-Hungarian trenches. The experience of 1915 had convinced Konrad von Hötzendorf that well-entrenched infantry could beat off any Russian attack. In May 1916, he wrote a report in which he highlighted the powerful role played by strong frontline defenses, machine guns, and artillery in breaking up Russian assaults at range. In particular, he emphasized that the first trench should be heavily reinforced and occupied. Generally, the Austro-Hungarian front line was behind 3 belts of wire and consisted of deep trenches featuring overhead cover, fire steps, timber, concrete emplacements, and nearby shelters. Lines were spaced out about 50 to 100 meters apart, but although the front trenches were heavily reinforced, those further back were not. In some places, Austro-Hungarian rear lines were poorly constructed and, according to Brusilov, comfort trumped defensibility. Many shelters had been designed for comfort. The walls and ceilings were covered with boards or planks, and where possible, glazed window frames had been fitted. Some had portable iron stoves, and there were bunks and shelves. Officers had suites of 3 or 4 rooms with a kitchen, painted floors, and papered walls. The Austro-Hungarians also prioritized firepower in these frontline positions. The infantry now had more firepower, with 4 Schwarzlose M712 machine guns per battalion, as well as 90mm light mortars. The Austrians positioned their artillery just behind the front as well, to give it maximum range. Despite their strong positions, the passivity of the Austro-Hungarians created problems. Hardly any thought was given to active defenses, counterattacking, or withdrawing, while training had been replaced with digging and snow clearing. The front lines also became crowded. With 2/3 of their strength in the first line, there was little strength in the rear to prevent a breakthrough if that line was penetrated. The Austro-Hungarian General Staff failed to pay much attention to intelligence reports concerning Russian troop buildups, sapping activity, and intercepted communications. Conrad remained convinced that Russia lacked the ability to decisively break through. Vienna even transferred 4 veteran divisions with their heavy guns and ammunition to the Italian front, where they began an offensive on May 15th. So the Austrians were vulnerable in the east, but on the march in Italy, so the Italians requested assistance from their allies. Among the Russian General Staff, only Brusilov was willing to attack earlier than planned. At the start of the offensive, Brusilov sent a message to his troops. "It is time to drive out the dishonorable enemy. All armies on our front are attacking at the same time. I am convinced that our Iron Armies will win the victory." The Russian summer offensive of 1916 began June 4th on Brusilov's southwestern front, followed by Evart's front on June 14th. The first Russian artillery barrages hit the Austro-Hungarian front lines at 4 a.m. Their impact appeared minimal, and soon after they lifted, the defenders rushed to the firing steps to receive the expected Russian attack. But no mass attack came. Instead, smaller Russian groups moved forward and probed the Austro-Hungarian line. Among them were Russian artillery observers who called in additional strikes which hit with more accuracy. Once again, the Austro-Hungarians ran for cover, and once again, they emerged afterwards to fend off an attack which didn't come. This cycle repeated several times on the first day, which demoralized the defenders. Soon, fewer and fewer Austro-Hungarian troops emerged to man the firing line. Only in the evening did the main Russian assault begin. Russian troops emerged from their sap trenches as close as 50 meters from the Austrian front line, often entering before the defenders came out of their shelters. The attackers captured huge numbers of Austro-Hungarians, as one new prisoner of war recalled. It was already 5 seconds after the artillery was no longer directed at the first trench. In the 6th second, perhaps a spirited defender cried, "To the trenches!" In the 7th second, he ran into someone on the stairwell, and under a low-hanging balcony that was splintered and torn to pieces, a hand grenade skidded after. And in the 8th second, a voice from above called down to the men in the cellar that they should give themselves up. All resistance was useless. Machine guns already stood in front of every entrance to the caves. The trenches had been taken. By the end of June 6th, the Russians had already captured 40,000 prisoners. Austro-Hungarian units did hold off the Russians along much of the line, but the Russian 8th Army broke through towards Lutsk, while the 9th Army made gains in the south. The Austro-Hungarians withdrew to poorly prepared rear trenches, only to be once again forced out by the Russians. With much of the Austrian artillery ammunition relocated to the Italian front, Habsburg artillery support was sporadic and uncoordinated. Austrian requests to withdraw flooded into headquarters, overwhelming commanders like Joseph Ferdinand. By the time he responded, units had already fled. Neighboring units who'd not been attacked also withdrew to avoid being cut off. Ferdinand's 4th Army fell back to the Lutsk bridgehead, a previously well-fortified position. But it was now in a state of disrepair and was overlooked by Russian-controlled hills. The Russians destroyed the position, sending surviving Austrian units back across the river. Austro-Hungarian command blew the bridges across the Styr before most of their men could cross, and 59,000 out of 61,000 were trapped on the opposite bank. On June 7th, the Russians took Lutsk, and by mid-June, they carved a 60-kilometer deep salient into the Austro-Hungarian line. In the south, Czernowitz fell on the 18th, threatening the Carpathian mountain passes into Hungary. The offensive appeared to be an unprecedented success. The Austro-Hungarian army lost 54% of its troops. Ferdinand's Fourth Army was reduced from 117,800 men on June 4th to just 35,000 4 days later. Russian casualties were also high, but acceptable by the standards of the day. Kaledin's Eighth Army lost 32,000 in the same time period. Conrad desperately called for German assistance, and they rushed reinforcements to the region. Brusilov's armies were on the march, with the Austro-Hungarians in full retreat, and the scene was now set for Ewart to strike in the north. As June 14th approached, Ewart complained of strong German forces in the region, poor weather, and a lack of artillery. He requested a delay until June 18th and eventually then July 3rd. Rumors began to swirl that Ewart was afraid that his attack would not meet the unexpected success of Brusilov, which would make Ewart look bad. With Ewart delaying, the Tsar shifted priority to Brusilov's front on June 18th. What started as a diversionary attack would now become the main effort. Brusilov was outraged and later blamed Ewart, Kuropatkin, and Alexeyev. I was well aware that the Tsar himself bore no guilt because he was a mere amateur in military affairs. Alexeyev grasped very well, though, how the situation had developed and how criminally Ewart and Kuropatkin conducted themselves. Had another military man stood at the head of the Russian army as supreme commander, Ewart would have been dismissed without delay from his post for indecisiveness, and Kuropatkin never would have found a place in the active army. Brusilov now hastily added a strategic dimension to his offensive. Russian forces would attempt to exploit the Eighth Army's success, capture the railway junction at Kovel, and push north to Baranovice. However, when they renewed their attack in late June, the Central Powers' defense was more organized, and German troops were arriving in large numbers. Although Russian units continued to advance across the front, casualties were mounting, and German counterattacks stunted their assaults. Still, the Germans were surprised at the tenacity of the Russian soldiers. Historian Rudolf Jerebek commented on this phenomenon. Just to show the Pickelhaube over the top of the trenches was no longer enough to strike fear and horror into the Russians. German commanders now gained increased control over Austro-Hungarian formations. Archduke Joseph Ferdinand was relieved of his command, and German Major General Hans von Seeckt took over the Austrian Seventh Army. The fighting went back and forth as reserves and ammunition dried up on both sides. When Ewart's attack finally went ahead on July 2nd, it failed almost immediately. Attacking using the old Russian tactics, he lost 80,000 men for negligible gains, almost all of which the Central Powers soon recaptured. And Brusilov's commanders were abandoning their more innovative tactics as well. The new tactics required lengthy preparation and planning, which was no longer possible. In the push against Kovel, they ordered mass assaults which led to high casualties and lowered morale. By late July, the battle entered a desperate phase as what remained of Russian veteran troops smashed against the Stochod line near Kovel. Although they did advance, there was no breakthrough. The Germans took advantage of Russian caution and launched counterattacks to slow the advance. With the men exhausted and far from their railheads, Brusilov's generals chose to consolidate their gains. In the south, progress was better, but there was no strategically significant target which would benefit the whole front. When Romania finally did enter the war on August 27th, it greatly extended Brusilov's front line, requiring him to divert troops away from his own offensives. Fighting continued until October, but it was clear by August both Kovel and the Carpathian passages to Hungary were out of Russian reach. The Brusilov offensive is often considered the most successful Russian offensive of the war, and one of the most successful offensives of any belligerent. 400,000 Austro-Hungarian troops were taken prisoner, and the Habsburg Empire was directly threatened. But did the offensive actually have a significant strategic impact on the war in general? The Brusilov offensive did have some tangible effects. The attack succeeded in terms of its stated goal, which was to relieve the Verdun and Italian fronts. The Russian attack forced the Central Powers to shift 30 divisions to the east. This likely contributed to the French victory at Verdun, but the Italians had already stopped Conrad's offensive by the time Brusilov attacked. Some historians have suggested Brusilov was a brilliant tactician, but not a brilliant strategist. His offensive lacked an overall strategic goal other than the destruction of the enemy. Historian David Stone suggests that Brusilov's broad front approach meant that he was only likely to break through in the least strategically important areas. Brusilov had prepared the rupture of the enemy's lines where it could be most easily affected, but this was the result of the inferior strategic importance of the points selected, and for this reason they could be expected to have been less carefully prepared for defense. In any case, the center of gravity of the Eastern Front was the German, not the Austro-Hungarian army. Brusilov's offensive did little to change the status quo or disposition of the two forces in the critical north. In fact, by bringing the Austro-Hungarian army under tighter German control, the Brusilov offensive arguably made the Central Powers stronger in the east, at least in terms of unity and competence of command. Russian General Mikhail Belyaev appeared to understand this dilemma. The Emperor is as firm as ever in his determination to continue the war until Germany is compelled to accept our terms. But if our military position has greatly improved of late in Galicia, we have not yet begun to attack the German forces. Putting things in their best light, we must still anticipate a very long and severe struggle. But of course, it should also be stated Brusilov did not originally intend for his attack to be strategically decisive. That was supposed to be Evert's job in the north. Even so, killing and capturing large numbers of the enemy as Brusilov did can have a strategic impact. Morale certainly plummeted among the Austro-Hungarian troops, at least according to Russian reports. All Austrian officers, without exception, expressed their complete certainty in their own defeat and confirmed complete confusion in their high command. They also do not believe in the success of the German defense and are certain that the Allies are, however slowly but methodically and carefully, winning. All this came at a huge price. Estimates greatly vary, but to inflict possibly more than 1 million casualties on the Central Powers, the Russians might have lost around 1 million casualties of their own. The Brusilov offensive was one of the most costly in history, but by the time it ended in fall 1916, the First World War was far from over, and in Russia, unrest was brewing against the Tsar and his generals. Our team here at The Great War love producing detailed military history documentaries like the one you just watched about the Brusilov offensive. But did you know that we also produced the most detailed documentary about the Battle of Berlin in 1945? 16 Days in Berlin is a 4.5-hour, 18-part series that covers the Berlin offensive day by day. It features original film footage from Soviet cameramen, never-before-seen photos of the battle, detailed maps and animations, and expert interviews with David Willey from the Tank Museum, Ian from Forgotten Weapons, and more. Unfortunately, we can't upload this series to YouTube because it shows the grim reality of the Second World War, and that would get us demonetized or worse. In fact, just the trailer for the series just got demonetized on YouTube. So, where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin in 4K resolution? On Nebula, a streaming service that we built together with other creators and where we can upload documentaries without the fear of demonetization. And every new Great War and real-time...
That's for the guys that like the... you know... microwave a bag of popcorn and watch a documentary. That's for them guys. That's pretty much my club right there.
History video is also on Nebula and earlier than it's on YouTube. Plus, it's ad-free. I'd like to thank Mark Newton for his help with this episode. And as usual, you can find all our sources for this episode in the video description. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War, a production of real-time history and the only YouTube history channel that still dares show its Pickelhaube above the trenches. The Battle of the Somme was one of the bloodiest of the First World War. From July to November 1916, millions of men struggled to fight in mud, under crushing shell fire, or in a hail of machine gun bullets. The Somme has been a synonym for the futility of trench warfare, but also the subject of fierce debate. Who really won the Battle of the Somme? At the end of 1915, the Allies needed a plan. The Central Powers had smashed the Russian army, finally crushed Serbia, contained Italy, defeated the Gallipoli landings, and stopped the French offensives in the west. At Chantilly, Allied planners decided to use their advantage in numbers and agreed on massive summer offensives for 1916, in the east, in Italy, and in the west. French commander Joseph Joffre decided the attack in the west should come along the Somme River, where the British and French sections of the front met. Since France had a much larger army than Britain, French forces would take the lead in the joint operation. But in February 1916, the Germans struck first at Verdun. The French army held them off, but at great cost, and as the weeks went by, Allied planners were forced to adjust. The partly untested British army would now have to shoulder most of the load on the Somme. What was not clear is exactly what the offensive was supposed to achieve, other than relieving the growing pressure on Verdun. Joffre talked about a breakthrough past Péronne and Bapaume, but the French did not have enough reserves for it. British commander Douglas Haig also had thoughts about breaking out of the German system of fortification after wearing them down, but there weren't any significant communications.
Alright, I've been recording for 37 minutes, so that was, I'm gonna have a little bit of a rest, and then I'm gonna get up at 7 o'clock. And I'm gonna listen to the most beautiful girl that walked out on me. I said, was she cool? Oh yeah, she was cool as alright, yeah, she was. I don't know. Alright. It's Monday, you know what that means. Alright. Gotta go. Short video today. This one's going on the 30th. Alright. Good night.